Hi, my name is Stephanie Morrison, and I'm a grad student in tax here at the University of Hartford. And for our course, Seminar in Taxation, I will be discussing Code Section 25C and Code Section 25D, which are the residential energy tax credits. I'm going to start out with the purpose of these credits and kind of the history and where they started. The first residential energy credits that we saw introduced were as a part of the National Energy Act of 1978. This act was a result of the 1973 oil crisis, where the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries instituted an oil embargo on the United States. This quadrupled the price of oil, and it made the demand exceed the supply that we could provide domestically here in the United States. So this called for a reduction in the consumption of fossil fuels, and homeowners needed energy savings due to the increased prices of oil. The first energy tax credit had two components, which the first one was 15% of the first $2,000 of expenditures for energy conservation. And the second component was 30% of the first $2,000 in qualified expenditures for solar, wind, and geothermal energy, plus 20% of the next $8,000 in qualified expenditures. If you'll notice, these two components are kind of the start of 25C and 25D before they ever existed. This credit was carried through the crude oil windfall profit tax of 1980, and I'll let you read into my slides to learn more about this. But the major thing that changed with this tax was that second component was increased to 40% of the first $10,000 of expenditures, yielding a maximum value of $4,000. So that really increased that second part of the credit. Now, these credits were allowed to expire in 1985, and we didn't see any energy tax credits come back around until the Energy Policy Act of 2005. This act was introduced to combat growing energy problems under George W. Bush through a reduction in national consumption of energy. So still the same objective as we've seen before. But this act created the two new temporary residential energy tax credits, 25C and 25D, which ended up not being so temporary because those are the credits we still know today. 25C, when it was introduced, allowed for 10% of qualified energy efficiency improvements as a credit and the amount of residential energy property expenditures incurred during that year. It had a lifetime limitation of $500, and only up to $200 of that $500 could be for qualified window expenditures, no more. Code Section 25D allowed for 30% of qualified photovoltaic property expenditures up to a maximum of $2,000, 30% of qualified solar water heating property expenditures up to a maximum of $2,000, and 30% of qualified fuel cell property expenditures up to a maximum of $500 for each 0.5 kilowatt of capacity. Now let's kind of see how these have changed over the years. I put a nice little graph that you can look over here of all the different acts that changed 25C and 25D, but there was four that caused major changes to these acts. The first one was the 2008 Energy Act, which eliminated the $2,000 limitation on the credit allowed for a tax year for qualified solar electric property expenditures. In 2009, this credit, the credit was increased to 30% in 25C of the amount paid or incurred by the taxpayer and the amount of residential energy property expenditures paid. That was a huge increase over the 10% that we discussed before. The aggregate amount of credits for tax years beginning in 2009 could not exceed $1,500. So that completely eliminated that lifetime limitation of $500 with $200 of that $500 for windows. It also eliminated credit caps for qualified solar water heating, geothermal heat pump, and small wind energy properties while retaining the credit cap for qualified fuel cell property. So those $2,000 limits were all eliminated for most things except for the qualified fuel cell property. The 2010 Tax Relief Act introduced limitations on expenditures for residential energy property, which you'll see here, $50 for main air circulating fans, $150 for natural gas, propane, or oil furnace or hot water boilers, or $300 each for items of energy efficient building properties. Also, the lifetime limit of $500, $200 for windows was reinstated with the 2010 Tax Relief Act. In 2011, the credit for non-business energy property was reduced back down from 30% to 10% again. And with those specific dollar limits that you see above with that 2010 Tax Relief Act were reinstated. In 2016, we extended the REAP credit for 5 years so that it applied to property placed in service before January 1st, 2022, but only for solar electric property expenditures and qualified solar water heating property expenditures. The REAP credit for fuel cell property, wind energy property, and geothermal heat pump property will phase out after 2019. So let's talk about these credits now. 25C now is equal to the sum of 10% of the amount paid for qualified energy improvements and residential energy property expenditures paid or incurred. We still see that lifetime limitation of $500 with only $200 of that $500 being allowed for windows. And both the windows and the lifetime credit are in aggregate over a lifetime. So the residential expenditures limitation is still the same with those three that we saw before. And with Code Section 25C non-business energy property, this credit's only available for existing homes or for renovations to existing homes. It's not available for any new construction, and the credit has to be claimed in the year that the property is installed. For Code Section 25D, we see 35% of qualified solar electric property expenditures, 30% of qualified solar water heating expenditures, 30% of qualified fuel cell property with a limitation of $500 for each 0.5 kilowatts of capacity, 30% of qualified small wind energy property expenditures, and 30% of qualified geothermal heat properties expenditures. Now, there's no limitation other than that for the qualified fuel cell property expenditures. So that's a big deal. In future years, the credit rate is going to be reduced to 26% of qualified expenditures for property placed in service in 2020 and 22% for qualified expenditures for property placed in service in 2021. And then this credit 25D will expire in December 31st of 2021. Under Code Section 26A, the aggregate amount of non-refundable personal tax credits, including the REAP 25D, can't exceed the sum of the taxpayer's regular tax liability for the year. If the credit exceeds that limitation, the excess is carried forward. REAP credits, unlike 25C, are available for new construction, and unlike 25C, they can be carried forward. My position on these tax credits. Well, I'll remind you of the purpose, which was the reduction in demand for electricity using fossil fuels to promote new forms of renewable energy as an alternative and to reduce energy costs for homeowners. Now, if this purpose was achieved, we should see investment in residential energy home improvements, investment in alternative forms of energy production, and levels of residential energy use, fossil fuels versus renewable energy. So we should see renewable energy increasing. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, some investments in residential energy efficiency have increased since the introduction of 25C and 25D. So you can see through this graph that natural gas furnace have become more efficient. Air source heat pumps have become more efficient, and natural gas boilers have become more efficient. Investment in alternative forms of energy have increased. According to the U.S. Energy Administration, consumption of renewable energy sources has increased. Solar production, as you can see here, has significantly increased since that 2005 tax credits 25C and 25D were introduced. We can see that investments in wind energy have increased since those 2005 tax credits. And we can see from this graph that renewable energy consumption has increased over time. So you can see it with that yellow line right there, that actually where it started out with 541 trillion BTU, it's actually at 780 trillion BTU now. Notice that the levels of renewable energy consumed by the residential sector increased with the residential energy efficiency tax credits. In 2005, when residential energy tax credits were introduced again, renewable energy consumption levels began to increase once more. This seems to indicate that the credits for energy efficiency are a driver behind investment in renewable energy home improvements. Looking at the same graph, we must note that the use of electricity has continued to increase over time. So we can see that red line increasing over time. Renewable energy consumption has not really increased alongside of that line, which kind of tells us that electricity is not being sufficiently provided by renewable sources. So has the purpose been achieved? Investment in residential energy home improvements have increased. Solar, wind, geothermal, and biomass consumption have increased. Levels of residential electric consumption have increased, which is not good. And levels of renewable energy consumption has increased, which is good. 25C and 25D, the major issues that I see are that energy efficiency tax credits are not refundable. Only those with income after tax deductions can take advantage. This singles out low to middle income taxpayers who are often unable to take advantage. So this tax only really benefits higher income earners. How we could improve this, in my opinion, is to allow for a refundable tax credit of 25C and 25D. This would allow low to middle income homeowners to be incentivized to make energy efficiency home improvements. This could lead to a decrease in energy fossil fuel consumption. This could lead to increased energy savings for low to middle income homeowners and could lead to a higher rate of investment in renewable energy home improvements. And that's about all I have for the residential energy tax credits. You can check out my references at the end of the PowerPoint, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.